And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about families, work and care. My name is Anne Phoenix. I'm lucky enough to be one of the trustees on the Nuffield Foundation, and for my day job, I work at the Thomas Coram Research Unit in UCL Institute of Education, where I'm Professor of Psychosocial Studies. Now, this session, I think, helps to bring together some of the themes that we were engaging with this morning. And I particularly want to point out that Tim Gardam started off by saying that work will bring clarity out of complexity. And certainly when we're considering issues of families, work and care, there are many complex issues to consider. Other things that were said today also matter. That we have a tendency at the moment, and this was said in all the sessions, to think about lives as individuals that they are collective achievements. And so we need to think differently about them. And we need to think differently about them because one of the things that I'm sure we're all in this room committed to is to think about how, as Tim said again, we can build an inclusive and positive society. And when we think about those three issues and bring them together with families, work and care, we have to think about demography and the demographic shifts that are going on at the moment. And the one that's been discussed the most is certainly to do with the fact that we have an aging society. Society is aging, and that has profound implications, not just for the economics, as we discussed earlier, but also for how people experience family life, as well as experiencing work, and how they manage to do those things, and yet fulfill caring responsibilities and parenting responsibilities as well. So we have to think about the fact that those sorts of changes are not experienced in a uniform way, not the same by everybody. New opportunities make for new inequalities as well, and disparities are emerging to do with these issues. So we need to take an intersectional view, and that's something that again has come up in the earlier sessions, where we think about things like gender, ethnicity, place, and income, and how those things intersect in everyday lives over changing times. We know that there have long been deeply entrenched gender gaps in paid work and unpaid work, not just in income, in what's done as well. And those things have really substantial impacts on inequalities that make a big difference. But also, they affect the material standards that we talked about this morning. And they also have an impact on productivity. And all of those issues are very much in the Andrew Dilnot session, but also fit with some of the things that Anna Vignoles was saying and Robin Banerjee and so on. So, as our demography is shifting, so is work. And Kerry made clear that one of the things we're concerned with at Nuffield are technological changes. Technological changes are reshaping job roles. For example, many of us will be thinking about how much we should do remote working and how much we should do in the office itself. Those who have the choice as workers may have a choice also to influence the gendered balance of work and life. Others won't have that choice. So, how do we respond to these opportunities, these challenges, and move towards a society that's more productive, more caring, and more equitable? So that's the four people on the panel will fix this for us this afternoon. So, I'd like to introduce them all at once so that I don't take up time later on doing introductions again. We're going to start with Professor Jane Falkingham. CBE, who's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts as well. She is Vice President for Engagement and International and Professor of Demography and International Social Policy. She's also the Director of the ESRC Centre for Population Change, whose remit is to, and I quote, improve understanding of the drivers and consequences of population change both nationally and globally. And I think that that's absolutely brilliant for what we'll hear from her just now. We'll then have Professor Oriana Bandiera, who's a Fellow of the British Academy. She's a development economist and academic and is the Sir Anthony Atkinson Professor of Economics at LSE, the London School of Economics, where she directs the State Research Programme of the International Growth Centre. Her research focuses on development, labour and organisational economics. So we look forward to hearing from her next. And we will then move on to hearing from Deborah Cadman, who has an OBE and is a trustee of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She has more than 30 years' experience in local government and public service, most recently as the Chief Executive of Birmingham City Council and West Midlands Combined Authority. And she features in the Local Government Chronicles 100 Most Influential Leaders and has recently won the first Women Award for Public Service. So we look forward to hearing from her next. And Professor Brian Bell, who we'll also hear from, is a Professor of Economics at King's Business School, King's College London, and a Research Associate at the Centre of Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. He is also a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation. And if you want to look at your wonderful lanyards, and you'll be able to click with your phone and find out a great deal more about everybody. But immediately now, without taking up more time, I'd like to invite Professor Jane Falkingham to talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm honoured to be here, and it's a real thrill for me to be in London with this audience. There's so many old friends in the audience. I started my career at the London School of Economics under Professor Tony Atkinson, so really thrilled to share the stage as well. So I'm a Professor of Demography and International Social Policy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about demographic change and the implications for families, work and care. So I'm going to try and do 4 things. The first of all is just to give you a very brief outline of recent demographic trends. I'm sure you all know all of the things I'm going to show you, but I think it sets the scene for the conversation. I am going to show you some new results from my team at Southampton, where we're developing a kinship model to do modelling of kinship and the availability of kinship into the future. And the results that I'm going to show you actually were produced last Saturday. So I have to thank my team. Then I'm going to talk about patterns of unpaid care across the life course, draw out some of my own research on combining work and care in midlife, and then have a very quick forward look at some of the implications that are coming out of the modelling work that we're doing as part of the Connecting Generations research project within the Centre for Population Change. So, recent demographic trends. I don't think this should be a surprise to any of you. I'm sure you all study the birth rate, but I think it's really important to note the big peak in births in the early 1960s. And that big peak is 1964. We actually topped out in 1964. So that's why you can't get any 60th birthday cards this year. But that's important because that peak is moving through. So the 1960s baby boom are entering into their 60s now and will be moving forwards. And then you can see the echoes from that 60s baby boom. So we had a drop in the birth rate down to a low in 1977, then it picked up again
through into the 1990s, then fell down again in 2000. And then for those of us who work in the university sector, we're absolutely thrilled that the birth rate picked up again in 2000, and we've seen a growing number of 18-year-olds coming through. But I do keep telling my Vice-Chancellor that in 2010, the birth rate started to fall again. So from 2028, when that cohort starts to become 18, we're going to start to see a falling off. So we can't rely on that increasing number of undergraduates coming through. So that's the trend in births over a period of time. Life expectancy. I think this is one of the most amazing graphs. This is taken from an ONS from the decennial life tables. I just want to highlight that in 1900, the life expectancy at birth for men was 45. So it's pretty easy for Lloyd George to introduce the pension in 1908. But by the year 2000, so over the last century, life expectancy of men had risen to 75. Now, I'm a demographer. I probably shouldn't do this because these are period rates, but that's a rise of 30 years in 100 years. So that is 3 years in 10 years, or 3.6 months in a year, or 2.1 days in a week, or just over 7 hours a day. So we do have to celebrate the rises in life expectancy that we've seen. Combination of fertility and changes in mortality, we have an aging population. And I think that this is very well known to all of us. But it does mean that we are going to have a growth in the size of the population aged over 90 plus. It's going to triple between 2014 and 2034. So we've got time. Demographic change, we always know that it's coming, except when we see unexpected rises in the birth rate. But we've got to start planning now. But before we get onto the doom and gloom of planning for an ageing population, I do just want to reflect a little bit on the good news and something to celebrate. It's not often demography gets on the front cover of National Geographic or Time, so I just thought I'd show you those. But actually, a demographic colleague of mine, Professor Jim Vopel, who was the director of the Max Planck Institute in Rostock, speaking at the European Population Conference a few years ago, suggested that perhaps we needed to start rethinking what we mean by old age. And he suggested that perhaps we chance of dying and start becoming very old when we face a 10% chance of dying. So I thought, okay, I'll take that idea and I'll apply it to the UK and see what it looks like. So this is a plot of the age schedule of mortality. So you face a 1% chance of dying when the death rate is 100 per 100,000, and you face a 10% chance of dying when the death rate is 1,000 per 100,000. So ignore the first few months of life, because those are the most dangerous. Then you see deaths fall, and then you see they rise. So you can read off the ages at which we hit those probabilities. It's a bit tricky on the graph, so I've turned them into a table for you. And I think for men, it's just a very easy soundbite. So in 1951, a man had a 1% chance of dying at age 50. And by 2001, this had changed to 65. So men really can say that 65 is the new 50. Women, the numbers they're not quite such soundbitey, but 87 is the new 75. That's when you get older. For women, it's 69 is the new 56. But what this means is that we do have to start rethinking chronological age, and particularly we have to start rethinking chronological age as the passport into a whole series of benefits. And I did give this talk to a number of people at DWP, but of course it raises the issue that, as Anne said, these are averages and there's a lot of differences. characteristics. And I'm just going to remind us that there are really big differences in life expectancy by place. So if we do move away from chronological age, I think we're going to have to do so very, very, very carefully, so we don't actually disadvantage particular groups. And indeed, the changes in the state pension age, which we're already living through, are actually disadvantaging some particular groups. I was struck in the first session, I think Andrew Dealnot's just left, but he was talking about a young woman aged 25 today, and whether she would expect to get a pension. Well, when I was 25, I expected to retire at age 60. And now I'm going to retire at age 67, 68, and who knows, it might change as we go forward. Okay, so that's the demography. These are the results from the kinship model that people in my team at the University of Southampton are developing. And these are very fresh results. But changes in fertility and mortality are changing the number of kin individuals may expect to have surviving at different ages across the life course. So with improvements in mortality, people are more likely to have multiple generations of kin alive, with those currently in midlife much more likely than previous generations to simultaneously have adult children, grandchildren, siblings, as well as older parents. And you can download these results from Working Paper 74 on the Connecting Generations website. We've actually published it this morning, so it's available for people to download should they wish to. Again, I've put it into a table because it's difficult to pull the numbers out from the graphs. But this shows you the mean expected number of surviving kin at age 50 by different birth cohorts. And you can see that the 1946 and the 1964 cohort are much more likely to have kin of multiple generations alive than the previous generations. And I'm going to be coming back to these numbers at the end of my talk. So thinking of patterns of unpaid care across the life course, we have a question on carers in the census. So this is actually taken from the 2021 census. Unfortunately, the data for Scotland is not yet available because they delayed their census until 2022. So we're still waiting for the Scottish census to be released, and we will then be able to get more of a GB picture. But I think the one takeaway from this is, first of all, at ages under 75, a higher proportion of women than men are providing care, but also caring peaks for women in midlife, age 55 to 59, just under 20%, one in every in care. And for men, there is a kind of a double peak. It also peaks in midlife, then it falls down, and then it peaks again in later life, which I'll come back to as well. The census also has information on hours of care. And I think, interestingly, the census does ask about care for everyone in the household aged over 5. So we can actually look at child carers. And you can see that there's just under 2% of people aged under 18 are providing care, and some of them quite intensively. But basically, at younger ages, it's less intensive care, under 20 hours a week. But you can see that the yellow and the light blue top of the bars, which is 35 hours or more care a week, actually rises as you go through the life course. And in later ages, there are really quite intensive care being provided. And that pattern, or that distribution of hours of care, is replicated also for men, with the intensity of care rising as you go through the life course. And now it's stopped working. Is there another one? Here we go. So we can get more information on caring from our wonderful Understanding Society data set, and this shows you the percentage providing uncare by relationship to recipient. And here we've broken it out into people who are caring for spouses, Those are the blue lines for men and women. For parents, those are the kind of brownie lines, again, for men and women, and then for friends. And unsurprisingly, you can see that caring for parents is peaking in midlife, and caring for spouses is peaking in later life. And if you look at the drop-off of women providing care for spouses at ages 80 plus, that's because, unfortunately, women's spouses are likely to be men, not always, but are likely to be men, and men have higher mortality at later older ages. So actually caring at ages 85 plus, there are more older men caring than there are older women. And I think that's something that's forgotten. And so here I've just picked out the percentage who are providing unpaid care of 50 or more hours a week. And I just want to highlight that 1 in 13 men aged 85 to 89 are providing 50 or more hours of care a week. So that's really quite a considerable amount of caring. So although I'm now going to turn to focus on midlife, I did just want to highlight that caring is actually something that goes on across the life course. So looking at combining care and work in midlife, quite some time ago actually, my long-term collaborator, Maria Evandrew, wrote a paper on multiple role holding in midlife and highlighted that people can be partners, parents, grandparents, daughters, sons, workers, carers, volunteers, and very often all of these roles are actually peaking at one point in the life course. So for the last 5 or 6 years, Maria and I have been focusing our research actually on midlife. Probably no surprise because we are currently in midlife, so very interesting to look at midlife. But we also have, again, some amazing data sets in the UK, and our research has most recently been focusing on using data from the National Child Development Study, where we can follow people across time. So using data from NCDS and looking at that cohort when they're age 55, 80% had at least one parent or parent-in-law alive, 29% had at least one parent and parent-in-law and one grandchild alive, of whom around 90%, 88% of the men were in paid work and 3/4 of the women were in paid work. So they're working and they're at risk of providing care in both directions. So and we're not alone in this, by the way, in the UK. This is from the SHARE data for Europe, and it just shows the percentage of those in midlife who are at risk of being caught in the middle across Europe. So it's something that's going on right across Western Europe, well, Northern Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and in North America, and increasingly in other parts of the world too. At the same time, as people having more kin alive in midlife and more likely to have older parents due to improved life expectancy and to have grandchildren, government policies have been focusing on extended working lives, or I think DWP now calls it fuller working lives. And you can see that that's actually been very effective, and the employment rate for women has been increasing. So in 1992, just under half of women aged 50 to 64 were in work, and by 2023 this was over 2/3. So our research wanted to explore the dynamics of social care and paid work in midlife. And what we were able to do was use their National Child Development Survey to track the same people between age 50 and age 55. And we looked at the effects of caring for parents and parents-in-law on the probability of changing work status. So either reducing the number of hours you're in work or actually stopping work altogether. And whether this varied by the type of support people were giving and the intensity of that support. So I'm not going to go into all of the logistic regression models that we ran. And if any of you want to read the paper in full, you can. It's published in Aging and Society. But just to give you the highlights, So after controlling for all sorts of factors, including education, socioeconomic differences, etc., women who are providing personal care were 1.7 times more likely to stop working than women who are not providing care. And men who increased their caring hours between age 50 and 55 were 1.65 times more likely to stop working. And increasing the intensity of hours of care was almost doubled the risk of leaving employment amongst women. So what this is doing is this research is highly we have to do something. We have to do something that supports people to actually be able to combine those multiple roles. So thinking about how to facilitate women and men to combine paid work and parental care in midlife will be increasingly important in the context of longevity. Almost there. I told Fiona not to panic. When I got to menopause, I was almost about to stop. And this is another piece of work that is using the National Child Development Survey, because as well as collecting information on care and work, they also very helpfully collected information on menopausal symptoms. And we did the same analysis just to look at transitions in employment during midlife and the impact of the menopause. I'm really delighted to say that this work was cited in Caroline Noakes's committee on gender and equality, and it was picked up in some of the work on the menopause that's been going on over the last 2 to 3 years. But you can see the results there. But basically, women who have severe symptoms have a much higher chance of exiting employment and reducing their working hours. And our next step in the work is actually to try and combine looking at menopause and care and work and midlife, because actually all of these things are interacting as we move through the life course. So we're almost there, but I just thought I'd give you a forward look. So just to look at those who are born in 1964 and how they are moving through the life course. So I think we all know we have an aging population. The numbers are quite stark though, so I might just read these out so I don't get the numbers wrong. But in 2024, there are currently 9,591,000 people aged 70 and over, but by 2040, $380,000, that's quite large. But the numbers aged over 90 and over are going to double from 629,000 today to 1.173 million in 2043. So there are going to be many more older people in need of support. So looking forward, this is the same table as I showed you earlier, but now this is looking at kin at age 80. And I've added an extra line in here. So you can see that actually when the 1964 cohort get to age 80, they're going to have fewer children than the 1946 cohort, and they're going to have fewer grandchildren. But I think importantly, there's going to be a much larger proportion of that cohort who were childless. So they finished their reproductive life at the end of their 40s and they were childless. Now that doesn't mean that they are actually socially childless, but it means that they're biologically childless. And I think what that is indicating is that we're going to have to start thinking about different relationships, because another thing you can highlight there is actually they're more likely to have siblings than previous cohorts, because of course they were part of a big cohort. So they will have nieces and nephews, and they will have different forms of kin. And there's very little research to date that's focused on understanding the relationship between these one-step removed kin. And they're probably also more likely to be part of blended families. And again, we don't have very much research looking at care between stepchildren and step-parents and parents-in-law. and blended families. So I'm just going to leave you with this final graph, and you can see that it's actually been taken from the modelling. We didn't have time even to tidy it up properly. But this is from my postdoc Joe, who's done this work. And this is a projection on the number of women who are childless at ages 80 and above. And it's projected to increase significantly, rising from 256,000 in 2030 to 656,000 in 2055. So those are childless women aged 80 and over. Now, you're going to ask me about men, I know, and demography is one of those disciplines where we look at women much more than we look at men, because it's much easier to look at fertility for women than it is to look at men. But there will be similar numbers of childless men as there are childless women from those cohorts. So I think that's the challenge out to us all to have a think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Oriana.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here, especially now that I know that I'm about 35 years old. Much better than I thought earlier. So I'm going to talk about an aspirational goal here, which is ungendering the economy. Gender matters for many things. It shouldn't matter for the economy, for the works that we do. This is based on work with very many people who are all listed there. So let's start from the good news. Women have made incredible progress when it comes to rights, political rights, economic rights. Everything has been improving steadily. Of course, there are countries in which these are still not at the level that one would wish to be. In these pictures, the darker colors means good news, that is equality. So women have made incredible progress in the last 100 years. We cannot say the same when it comes to jobs and economic participation. This depicts 2 points, two countries, the UK and the US in both, plus the other one has a line for the world. You see that these lines have been going up and then they've been plateauing. But while the political empowerment line has been plateauing at 1, because it can't go any higher, well, technically can, but we don't want to go there. The female labor force participation one has been more than parity. There is a much more important difference between the two. And this is that in terms of rights, the closing of the gap is due to the fact that women have caught up with men. So women have improved. When it comes to the labor gap, both in terms of participation and hours worked and earnings, most of the closure of the labor gap is due to some men getting worse. So that is not women improving. So it's not a concerted effort for an improvement. It's just that the economy works so that low-skilled men, because of technological progress, have lost their jobs, and hence low-skilled women who have jobs like such in care that is not easily done by machines are doing better. And there is more recent evidence that actually older men tend to stay in position of power much longer for young graduates. So young men graduating from college are doing worse than they did 20, 25 years ago. And so women and men just graduating are doing more similar. Again, not because women are doing better, but because men are doing worse. So the closure of the gap doesn't seem such good news all of a sudden. Now, why does this happen? Well, clearly the main difference between men and women is that the division of labor is highly gendered. In most couples, men specialize in work in the market. They sell the labor to firms and the like, whereas women do the bulk of work inside the home, either exclusively or together with the market. Now, this division matters for the simple reason that work inside the home is not considered work. When you meet a woman and say, where do you work? If they don't work, the answer is, I'm a stay-at-home mom. No, I stay at home. I don't work, I stay at home while they're at home. Ironically, most of the business cases for women that you see make the point that this is a good case, it's a good idea for women to go to work because there will be an increase in the labor supply. More workers, more factor of production, more labor in the economy, higher growth. Because these women are not working while they're at home. Of course, once you consider that the work that they're doing at home must be done by somebody else, either the labor supply in net does not change, but if it does change, it's because women are working more hours. So we cannot say that that's a welfare improvement. Clearly, this is not fair. Right? It's not fair because as long as social status, education and economic opportunities and political power are closely linked to market work, and as long as home production is not afforded the same status, gender division of labor is mostly a matter of justice. But this is one of the very rare cases in which it's not a zero-sum game. That is, to improve equality, we don't need to sacrifice anything because skills are uncorrelated with gender. If they look correlated, it's because we look at them that way through the lenses of centuries of social norms. So at least some women, and obviously some men, are misallocated. There are many men who would be great cooks, and they're working as engineers because they were told that men have to be engineers. And likewise, many women who would be great engineers and are staying at home. So gender neutrality, that is allocating people to jobs without looking at their gender, like we don't look at the eye color or at the height, would improve the matching between workers and jobs and reduce misallocation. So it's not a matter of more hours of work because women are already working, we just don't call it work, but rather skills and jobs. There are estimates in the literature that suggest that these gains are very large. This is at the macro level. Xie and co-authors show that between 20 and 40% of US growth in the last 40 years is down to an improved allocation of talent. That is to the fact that nowadays women can be doctors and lawyers, and people who are not white can be doctors and lawyers. We have some recent work in a firm, a global firm that operates in many local markets, where we show that the lower the labor force participation of women in the country, the more productive, the better paid, the more easily to promote are the women who come to work, which means that there are different barriers. Women face higher barriers, and those women who come over the barrier are, of course, a lot more productive. Now, the firm could do better by hiring more women. But to hire more women, they would have to pay them more. And that would create a much larger inequality between men and women in favor of women, especially in those countries where the norms say that women should stay at home. So that's not going to be feasible. That is just to point the fact that individual firms cannot do much. As individuals, when the problem is due to social norms, as individuals, there's not much to do because in order to decrease the gap in participation, you have to create a gap in pay. So why? Why is the labor force gendered? Well, an obvious answer is biology. Only women can have children, at least as of today. And this map comes from my colleague Camille Landais and his co-authors from the Hub of Equal Representation that we have at the LSE. This is the share of the gap between men and women, which is explained by childbirth, by having a child. And again, the darker color, the larger the share. In places like the UK, Europe at large, the US and Australia, that share is about 98%. So all the differences that we observe between men and women in the labor market are due to children. Why is that the case? Well, obviously women give birth to children, but that doesn't mean that they have to, take care almost exclusively of the children. The first easy thing is the men are from Mars, women are from Venus explanation. Women are kinder, they are, whatever, different. So what we did in 2 separate papers was to take studies that measure a trait which is important for the labor market and on which there is lots of research, to aggregate them together and in a way that the total is more than the sum of the parts, because each study is informative about what the other studies should find. And in these 2 papers, we look at how women respond to financial incentives, because a major theme in the literature is that women are not competitive. So you give them financial incentives, they don't work hard, whereas men work harder, and that's why they're paid more. We find no difference whatsoever. All the studies put together, the difference between men and women is exactly 0. Likewise, overconfidence. Of course, when we see a result on overconfidence, we say, oh, men, they're always overconfident. But if you look statistically, there is no such big difference. So women are Thank you a lot for this. We work with a large multinational. They ran an experiment, which I don't have time to explain in great details. But what the experiment does is basically to encourage people to be themselves at work. These lines here are priorities at work, and the bar is the difference between men and women. So we ask people, which are your main priorities at work? And this is in the control group, okay? So we see that, as you can imagine, women want more flexible time, more work-life balance, all the standard things. Men want more prestige, more interesting jobs, and so on. So this is what you ask people in the control group, business as usual, what's important for you at work. It's not surprising. So from this, you will conclude people have different preferences. This is what happens to people who are part of the experiment, and they take this workshop and they express their true self. Right? You can see the scale is the same in the 2 graphs, so the gaps are much smaller, and they're all over the place. There is no more difference between men and women in a stereotypical way. So this is my attempt at overlapping the 2 graphs to show you that the 2 go everywhere. That's not a very successful attempt. Now, norms. I wouldn't need at least 30 minutes to talk about norms. But just 2 things. The picture there was from the first coronavirus wave, was the NHS and government together, stay at home. Thankfully, this screen is very big. You can see the pictures, you can see what the men are doing at home and what the women are doing at home. This was it wasn't intentional, I believe. This is a sense of these are the norms in society. If women are at home, they clean, they iron, they teach the children. So, where does this leave us? Well, policy. Clearly policy, if the gender gap is closing just because men are doing worse, some categories of men are doing worse, whatever policies we're using are not working. And I can see some points of inconsistency. So for instance, family policies assume that a woman is the main carer, but workplace policy requires gender neutrality. So women take 6 months per child at least, but when they go back to the workplace, they cannot have 6 months to catch up, because on the workplace, everybody must have the same treatment. Another one, which is mind-boggling to me, is that childcare is treated as consumption rather than an investment, and so is not tax deductible. If I, as an academic, need to go to a conference and I want to take a nanny with me so that my children, because now I'm 35, my children can come with me, I cannot pay her from a research grant because that would be a benefit in kind. There is no tax deduction, no government loans for women who want to pay for childcare so that they can continue work. There are government loans if you want to go to university, yet they're both forms of investment. Why do we encourage girls to go into STEM but do nothing for boys? How is an economy supposed to work if there are only engineers? I mean, engineers are useful, no doubt, but we need carers, we need psychotherapists, we need a bit of everything. So all this push towards STEM only for girls without telling men it's interesting to do something else but engineering and math, I don't think it's going to work so well. And finally, why quotas? Because if it were purely a matter of labor demand, that is, firms, organizations not wanting to hire women, quotas would make sense. But here we have a big block on the labor supply. So quotas maybe not the most effective instrument. Now, as this is a foundation that funds research, I want to leave you with 3 questions, which I think are very open for research. The first is how to value housework. Attempts at doing this have been summing the cost of replacement service by service. So the woman cleans, how much would it cost to hire a cleaner? Woman takes care of babies or adults, how much would it cost to hire a carer? But that's a bit like saying that a CEO takes calls and goes to meetings. So what's the cost of a receptionist and what's the cost of a PR person? Women do a lot more than that. Running a house is a coordination job. It's a management job, effectively. And that's never taken into account. Why do mothers suffer a penalty? That is, I showed you the child penalty. But what I didn't show you is that the data shows that fathers, so men, as soon as they have a child, they earn a premium. Why is that? Could it be that perhaps the moment the woman stays at home, she does everything else, not just take care of the children. She waits for the plumber, she organizes the dry cleaning, she manages the home. So Olivetti shows that actually men work longer hours when they have a child. And finally, the biggest question is, will gender shape the future of work? I hope not. I think we are at a crossroad with all the possibilities of working from home, all the technological advances that we've had. So there is the possibility of going back, hopefully not in standards of living, but to the beginning of the economy where men and women were cultivating the same land and they were sharing equally domestic duty and economic duty. Now, that could be a much more advanced version where we still have much better standard of living than the countries where, by the way, if you look at the child penalty in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, it's basically 0 because neither men nor women go work in there are no jobs, that is, they're all on the farm. So will gender be relevant still? That only the future can tell, but I think we have to take into account what we know now, which is that at this rate, we're not going in the right direction because any improvement that we see, it seems to be a worsening from the other side, which is bad news for young men and unskilled men, and is definitely not good news for women. If you do remember one thing from this talk, please remember that this is not a zero-sum game, because when something is unjust and inefficient, you can fix both things, restoring equality and restoring efficiency. So when it's often seen as a zero-sum game, like now is our turn. I think that's counterproductive. I think the evidence suggests that we can improve and have a more just and more efficient society for all.
Could I now invite Deborah Cadman to just talk to us for a few minutes, raising things you want to raise and including anything that you've heard that we want to see.
Great, that's dangerous, talking about anything I like, isn't it? But, so I'm going to talk about two things, essentially, and try and relate it to practical application, but also relate it to some of the things that we've heard today as well. So the two things that I want to talk about is, the first one is early intervention and prevention. And we've heard a lot about the squeezed middle and the impact that that will have on families and the gendered nature of work. So some of the solutions has to be about preventing older people from needing the care in the first place. Now, that's going to be a real challenge. And if you could just indulge me for a moment, when I was Chief Executive of Suffolk County Council, we did a lot of work on how we could bring the cost of adult social care down, because it was huge and still is, actually. And for some of our residents, we worked out it would be cheaper to send them on a round-the-world cruise than it would to put them in adult social care. And that's a great Daily Mail headline. But the reality was the way in which we were stopping our elderly people defaulting into crisis and therefore demanding high-cost care wasn't and still isn't as good as it should be. And then intervening earlier in children, and I'll refer back to some of the stuff we heard around careers advice and support for families and children as well. But intervening early in a child's life has got to be the right thing to do. And I don't know, I would be surprised if anyone in this room disagreed with the fact that intervening and supporting young children at an earlier stage is the right thing to do, and then again stops them into accessing high-cost statutory services. And we heard a little bit about some of the really complex needs of some of our young people. And if I tell you that some of the care packages for some of our young children in Birmingham was about £50,000 a week. And all it takes is 5 or 6 of those young people to have those complex needs, and it immediately ratchets up the bill. And I did want to just replay a quote from Tim's speech earlier, and I'm probably going to misquote you on here, Tim, but you said, we need a wider periphery of vision to challenge the blink of political policy. And I've probably misquoted, but I think what you meant by that is that a lot of the stuff that we need to do isn't going to be felt immediately. So it's not one and done. So if we intervene early in a child's life, it's going to be 10, 15 years before we can really see the impact and realise the value of that as well. So the other thing I want to talk about is joining up the dots, and one of the things that drives me completely mad is that a lot of institutions and organisations operate in hermetically sealed bubbles. Now, we've heard a lot about the complexity of people's lives. So the solution has to be more involved than just a simple response from a single organisation or institution. And again, we're not particularly clever at doing this. And I think one of the real opportunities of the Nuffield Foundation and the research that you do is making sure the outcomes of that research that you either do yourself or commission others to do is understood and felt and is applied appropriately. Because there's lots of stuff that I've heard today, and I'm thinking, this is blowing my mind. But I don't believe other people are hearing that at all. So in my view, the Nuffield Foundation has a job to do to make sure all the investment it makes in the research and development work is known and felt and understood. I wanted to just talk a little bit about place as well. So, and several of you today have talked about place, either in your presentations or some of your questions. And there is a place in Birmingham called East Birmingham. And if I just do a quick run through of the statistics, so 40% of children who live in East Birmingham live in poverty. A third of children who live in East Birmingham are not school ready. And you know what that means. And there was the coverage of that on the news only this week, really, about the implications of children not being able to socialise properly, use a knife and fork, still being presented in nappies at the age of 3 and 4. And that disadvantage will stay with them throughout the whole of their education and potentially work career as well. So if ever there was an opportunity to look at the impact of early intervention and prevention and working closely with families and children and communities in a place, I would suggest it's that. High unemployment, coupled by high unemployment and a very low skills base. So if you are born in East Birmingham, not only are your life chances constrained, but your life expectancy is also constrained. Joined up at a national level, at a regional level, at a local level, and I would argue at a community level as well. Then I want to talk a little bit about inclusive growth, because again, this is something that's been raised on several occasions today. And I've got a particular take on inclusive growth. So places have three opportunities, simplistically, and do bear with me, simplistically, to obtain resources going into their place. The first one is local government, and that could be through council tax or business rates, retention, and that works great if you've got a really high council tax base. If you haven't, then it doesn't really count for much. And then the second opportunity is through central government grants, through grants from organisations like the Nuffield Trust and other such organisations. And the third opportunity, and bear with me, this is simplistic, is global investment. And if you look at certain places in this country, certainly some of the large cities, they literally have billions of investment, etc., etc. Now, if they are investing billions, the return will also be billions. Now, in my view, it is not unreasonable for those investors who will be in a place for a number of years to talk to them about investing in the place, investing in work, investing in public services. High Speed 2, for example, is going to take at least 20 years, if not longer, to actually complete. Now so a 5-year-old in Birmingham, and you could actually be a senior engineer working on that track. Now, are we as joined up as we need to be on that? Are we working with schools? Are we working with colleges? Are we working with universities? Are we working with DWP, etc., etc.? To a certain extent, yes, but is it as effective as it should be? I would argue no. But there are lessons that we have to learn, I think, as the future goes on. We talked a little bit about childcare, and I would actually, after listening to Robin and Ollie and Kadra, I would actually say maybe we ought to think about youth care as well. So, Robin, you talked about laying the foundations for adulthood. I think we need to be really intentional about that. We need to be clear about what the intention looks like. And Ollie, you said we need to rethink career readiness, but after hearing this, maybe we should also think about career re-entry as well. Because if people are taking themselves out of the workplace for caring responsibilities, we should allow them the opportunity to re-enter the workplace once their caring responsibilities have ended. So I'll probably stop there, but I've raised probably more questions than I've answered, but I'm really happy to kind of explore some of these a little bit further. Thank you
very much. Can I invite you as well, Brian, to do the same?
Thanks very much. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk mainly about immigration, although I'll talk a bit about social care as well, and build on quite a lot of what Jane was talking about in her presentation. And I should just say, since there's a general election going on at the moment, in no way does anything I say here have anything to do with the Migration Advisory Committee. One thing that's kind of interesting is that immigration has been the main driver of population growth in the UK for many years now. And I think it's true that, particularly given the birth rate coming down that you showed after 2010, for the next 20 or 30 years, it will be the only source of population growth. The ONS make these predictions as to how big the population will get to, and it's almost all driven by immigration in the next sort of 2 decades. It's a little unfair on the ONS, because all they actually do is look at what immigration was in the last 20 years and say it'll be the same again. So it's not quite a forecast, it's more just drawing a line. But I don't think anyone seriously thinks that there's going to be a sudden change in the natural population, so it's all going to be driven by immigration. That matters enormously, actually, not just for the UK, but actually much more importantly for parts of the UK. So for Scotland, for example, Scotland will shrink even with migration. and without migration it would shrink very rapidly, quite rapidly actually. Immigration policy, which I'm not going to comment on. And it also has effects actually not just in terms of the devolved nations, but also in terms of regions and areas of Britain. And one thing that's really interesting is that if you look at where migrants go, they all go to London, basically, pretty much. And it's kind of interesting that one question that we grappled with recently was, well, is it that the immigration system, now that we've left the EU, just biased towards London somehow? And there are reasons why it could be. For example, we have salary thresholds for workers. Well, it's easier to meet a salary threshold if you're being paid a London wage than if you're being paid a Dundee wage or a Swansea wage. But actually what's interesting is that the proportion of non-EU migrants who go to London on the work route for migration is almost exactly the same as the EU workers who came under freedom of movement. In other words, it's not much to do with it's to do with it's to do with London, but it's to do with the fact that's where people want to live. So they're choosing to go there because under freedom of movement they could have gone anywhere, but they went to London. So I think that kind of population change is going to be very different across the parts of the UK, and will almost certainly favour London and other big cities at the expense of rural areas. Having said that, there's no sense, as far as I can see, among policymakers as to what the population should be. I don't know what the right population size is. I have no idea what the right population size is, and neither do politicians, it seems to me, although they seem to make statements about what it shouldn't be. I do think there's an increasing focus on the impact of population in terms of particularly housing and in terms of public service provision. And I think that's where there's going to be kind of challenges going forward in terms of thinking about, well, are we going to live with the size of migration that we've had in the last decade or so, and what impact does that have on local communities, rather than perhaps the aggregate kind of effect. In terms of the age distribution, which I thought was really interesting, my sense is that immigration will have very little role to play here. That if all the simulations I've sort of seen, correct me if I'm wrong, but all the simulations I've seen suggest that the size of immigration you would need to fundamentally change the age distribution of the population is inconceivably large relative to the noise that's been, we've got 600,000 net migration recently. That has caused enormous political angst. The size that you would need to fundamentally change that, I don't think is realistic. So we're going to live with that age distribution, as it were. But I think what might help is that age distribution will have enormous consequences on different parts of the economy. So we talked about social care and health. It may be that immigration can help in those particular areas where there are struggles, and I'll come to social care in a minute. The other thing that did, and this is kind of, I don't know if this is an admission of economists' failure or kind of, and perhaps it's not, but I always worry that economists almost uniformly say migration doesn't here nor there, and I've written papers like myself on that. I always feel a bit uncomfortable in that, because if that's true, we're really bad at communicating it to the public because they think it matters. So it could be that we're just really bad communicators. That's definitely possible. But it could also be that it's not quite right. And the area where kind of I think it may not be right, and it gets back to this question about it's interesting that women wanted more flexible work. One interesting, and it's purely an anecdote, but it kind of really stuck with me. We did some work a year ago with a meat processing firm in Leeds. It was one of the companies that we talked to. And we were talking to them about, and they were complaining about Brexit and were saying it's a disaster because, we can't get the staff who work in the meat processing factory, who are all, I think this factory had 99% EU workers in its factory. And we were saying to them, well, and they were explaining why, and of course they don't want to admit it, but it's because it's really not very nice work and it's not very well paid. And so if you live in Leeds, if you can get a different job, you sort of do. And we were sort of saying to them, well, what did you do before the EU expansion? Because you couldn't have those workers then. So what, and they said, oh, well, we used to operate this thing where we'd collect from the local villagers around our meat processing factory. We'd have a bus that would collect women once the kids had gone to school. We'd drive them to the factory. They'd work I think it was a 7-hour shift so that they could be back in their village in time for the kids to come home from school. And we were saying, oh, well, perhaps, you could go back to that. And they were saying, no, that doesn't work for us. We want a 12-hour shift. And of course they wanted a 12-hour shift. I can see why they wanted that. But they didn't seem to think that they'd have to readjust their production technology because of this. And so actually I think, if there's, I hate to sort of say there's a silver lining to Brexit, but if there is one, it's that perhaps firms will have to adjust what they expect of workers and give that higher flexibility that you would want. And another example of that, just it was in the news last year, was that there's a big pub chain that in 2022 was saying, you know, Brexit's been a disaster because we can't get the staff now that we've reopened after COVID. We can't get the staff to fill the vacancies. So they had to close pubs down and not do lunch showers and that kind of thing. And interestingly, the year after, they made a statement to the stock exchange where they said, actually, this year we think it's going to be all right. And the reason was they deliberately decided to have a campaign recruiting the over 50s to work in the pubs. And again, it's the kind of thing where I wonder whether some of the effect of immigration is it makes it easier for firms to recruit easily. And actually, when you're forced not, when there's a constraint on that, you actually need to start changing how you recruit and who you recruit. And that may, in the end, be good for us in one sense. And then finally, I just want to come to social care, because obviously, in some sense, this is about immigration as well, particularly recently. And I think it's an example of where policymakers are quite good at partial equilibrium thinking and very bad at general equilibrium thinking. So one anecdote is that they were very surprised when care workers were allowed to come in on the immigration system. They were surprised how many dependents came. And we were saying, well, you know, people marry and have children, so that's quite acceptable. And the one thing they hadn't thought about was, of course, if they come with children, that costs the exchequer quite a lot of money, because it's like 5,000 quid a year to teach a kid in school. And they hadn't thought about that cost. And we were saying, yeah, it would have been easy if you just paid care workers better, because you wouldn't have needed the immigration then. And it's a good example of them not thinking about that effect. And there's a couple of nice papers in the US that think about this in terms of low-skill or low-wage migration. And one is about what happens to particularly high-paid women when you get low-skill migration. And there it's the same story, again, of that fact that usually low-skill migration seems to have no effect on anything, perhaps a little bit on low-wage workers in the domestic economy. What they did find was that there's quite a big effect on the labour supply of professional women, because actually it freed up time that they would have to spend caring for relatives or doing housework, that kind of thing. And so actually there's a positive complementarity, as it were, between those two things that's often underlooked. And related to that is a really recent paper that's just been published that points out that usually we conclude that low-wage migrants are bad for taxes or bad for public finances because they don't pay much tax, but they take public services. And again, the point was made, well, actually not necessarily, because if they're increasing the labour supply of higher skilled workers who, under a progressive taxation system, pay more tax, actually perhaps the benefit is much bigger than you might think it is. And so I think that's kind of an example of thinking more broadly about the kind of the benefits of immigration more broadly than just the final thing. And the final thing I would say is just is interesting about the gendered nature of jobs. The one thing I would say that's really interesting is that since social care was opened up for migration, it's become less gendered. So interestingly, migrants who come in on the work route for social care are much more likely to be men than in the current workforce. So actually there's some evidence that it may be very hard to convince British people, British men, to do care work, but actually you can sort of solve that gender problem in some sense by immigration. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, we've had these 4 very thought-provoking presentations, and I just want, I'll be coming to you in a moment for comments and questions, so if you could be thinking before I do. But give a chance to everybody on the platform to comment on the issues that have come up and to think about both policy issues and to think about, really what could Nuffield, for example, do in terms of research, what needs doing as well. So, some of the things that have come up, and again in the day actually, about the dynamism in trends and patterns to do with all these things, the fact that there's an interpenetration of work, home, and employer practices as well, that we have to think simultaneously about age, generation, gender, ethnicity, familial relations, as well as migration status, because the example that Brian almost ended with, that migrant men come into social care, that's no accident. It's about choices, it's about ethnicity, it's migration status intersecting. So it's not a straightforward gendered shift, although it is a gendered shift. We need to think about lifelong perspectives, and that's come out throughout the day as well, so that we think something else that people have talked about and that Oriana mentioned is that childcare, for example, as being thought of as consumption when it should be seen as investment. If we're thinking lifelong, perhaps that would be different. And that brings us to the fact that we need to think about long-term effects of different things and joined up policies, and those including housing and local communities. And all of you, I think, have talked about these sorts of issues. So what about policy? And if we start with you, perhaps thinking,
yes.
Jane, about policy and potential research.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to answer Brian, and definitely migration is not the solution for an ageing population unless you have migrants and then don't allow them to age in place, which is a tricky one. So I think that's there's been lots of work saying that migration isn't going to solve the age structure of the population. And indeed, we just happen to be alive at an incredible moment in human history where we are moving from having high death rates and high birth rates to low death rates and low birth rates. And when you go through that transition, you have a change from a population pyramid to a population skyscraper. And in 100 years' time, all the populations in age structures in the world will pretty much be skyscrapers, and we won't even talk about aging populations. It's just that we live at this moment of transition. So it's an interesting challenge for us. In terms of policy, it's very interesting because thinking about flexible working, we actually have the right now to request flexible working. But if we look at who requests flexible working, it's much more likely that women will request it than men. So I think we do need to think about how we change workplace cultures to make flexible working more acceptable. I think also we have to think in terms of the life course, and you were talking about, I think earlier on we were talking about the motherhood penalty. I think there is also a carer's penalty, so the care penalty in terms of pensions, and these things all add up across the life course. So thinking about how we as a society may give credits into pensions for childcare, but also for elder care, and how we also need to recognise grandchild care. All of these things need thinking through in a much more holistic way. And your point about intervention, I do have a unmet need in later life, and absolutely if you can make those interventions and stop those trips and falls, then you can save a huge amount of money, but that's a different paper. Thank you.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Oriana.
Thank you so much. So I will actually start from where you ended. The re-entry in the labor force is key. We have, so many women who have stopped working after having 2 children, and that would bring them to the age of 40, which you tell me then you're 20. So there is a lot of human capital which is not being, employed in the best possible way. And that's because for the past 20 years, they've been homemakers, and homemaking doesn't give you a line on a CV. So they're basically being long-term unemployed. And we know that the probability of hiring a long-term unemployed is very close to 0. So training programs, re-entry is absolutely key. However, then the carer penalty will materialize. I think if it doesn't materialize today, it's because people do not go back as much into the workforce. But the moment they do, then that will come into place. So I think that's very important. And the childcare as an investment is not only, I think, from the point of view of efficiency, but for equity as well, because as you were discussing with the West Birmingham, was it East Birmingham? No, I can't remember. Those children, they're in poverty, but they have the same skills on average and the same possibilities as every other child. So it's better for everybody. Again, it's one situation in which there is not a zero-sum game. Giving everybody a chance is better for everybody.
Thank you.
Deborah. So I've got a bit of a bugbear when we talk about childcare, and I think whilst we continuously talk about childcare as a women's issue, it will always be a women's issue. And we really need to stop doing that. We need to start talking about childcare being a parental issue. I think that's a really important point. And it's not a criticism of any of my colleagues, it's something that we all talk about. I do think we need to rethink childcare, and I think it needs to be done holistically as well. I was and remain a massive fan of Sure Start centres, not just around children, but families and family support as well. So I think in terms of policy, I would like to see something reintroduced around that. Maybe not Sure Start, but something at a local level that provides that support to those children, I would have thought. And then in terms of elderly people, let's get everyone on a round the world cruise. And just
Through Southampton, yeah.
Yeah, but just think differently about and we are still incredibly rigid, I think, about and very still in some places incredibly traditional in the way in which we treat work.
And thank you. And that's a lovely provocation to think differently. I would just throw in that around the issue of childcare as a woman's issue, that there have been whole periods where people talked about parents. And indeed, one of the things about feminist scholarship was saying, you know, what that obscures is the fact that there are these gender differences, and however much you talk about parenting, it doesn't necessarily immediately shift to equality. So I completely agree with you that we do need to think about it differently. We do need to make changes, but actually we also need not to use terminology that obscures social trends. And so on. Yeah.
Can I just, actually,
Yes.
there's just one other thing before I forget, just about migration. And I was talking to a colleague on the table earlier about my views of migration, really, and consumption. And whilst the Western world increases consumption, we will continue to contribute to climate change. And the more we contribute to the changing of the temperature of this world, there will be swathes of the globe that are uninhabitable. So migration is not going to go away, and it is not going to be reduced as long. I think this is a global issue, not just a UK issue, that needs a conversation about.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, Brian.
So perhaps I'll take you up on what should Nuffield be funding. My role as trustee first. Two things. First of all, I was thinking that social scientists tend to be very bad at getting the future right. But the one thing that really kind of you can be certain of, just given the pictures that Jane presented, is that we're going to have an ageing society. There's sort of no way around that because it's happening and it's going to happen. And therefore, this whole issue of care is going to be central. I mean, it's sort of, in some Andrew referred to it this morning when he was sort of talking about how much almost certainly GDP spending on health would have to increase in the next few decades. So it seems to me it's one of those rare areas where we're certain what's going to happen. There's going to be more requirement for social care and health care more generally. And so the implications of that for work seem to be first order importance. And there just hasn't been a lot of work on that. I mean, so I think kind of, if you're thinking of a big research project, thinking about that intersection between care and work seems to be a no-brainer in some sense, because it's going to increasingly go up a policymakers' agenda. Although I should caution that policymakers manage to avoid dealing with social care almost every election, so perhaps it'll take still another few decades. And then the second thing is in terms of what would be good to fund. The one thing I always think is that we're very bad at a lot of research that looks at employment and workers and wages, uses kind of, the labour force survey to produce some statistics and show some charts, as if employers have almost nothing to do with any of it, and it's kind of, and actually we should spend a lot more time talking to employers, either, qualitative type of research or quantitative where possible, and actually finding out what they're doing, what their production technology is, whether it can change, how it can be adjusted, that sort of thing. Because we don't do a lot of that. I mean, I'm reminded by a colleague at LSE, John Van Reenen, who has done this in management practices and has actually produced, really rich data, so economists like it. But it's about who's good manager, how do they manage, what works in their environment. And of course, Oriana has done some great work in the, about, you know, actually going onto farms and exploiting people, that's not the right word, changing their incentives and seeing how they respond. And that kind of employer-based research, I think, is really valuable. And we miss an awful lot when we just look at general surveys that tell you whether someone's in part-time work or full-time work. I think we need much richer kind of research in that area.
Thank you.